There's, the nuclear weapon states sort of try to maintain this myth that they exist only to deter the use of similar weapons by other countries, that they will never be used deliberately. First of all, we know that that isn't true. Nuclear weapon states, especially the United States, have used nuclear weapons in the past and have frequently threatened to use them again, even against non-nuclear countries. So these are viewed by the military, at least in the United States, and apparently in the other nuclear weapon states as well, not just as a deterrent, but as war-fighting implements, weapons that can and may be used under various scenarios. That truth needs to be underlined. We need to understand that these weapons do not exist simply to deter their use. They exist to be used. But beyond that, even if you assumed falsely that they only existed to deter their use, they're not very good at that. We know of at least 6 occasions when the world has come within minutes of nuclear war because deterrence failed, because one or the other nuclear weapons state, usually the United States or Russia, believed it was under attack and actually began the process of launching its own nuclear weapons, only to stop at the very last minute when the mistake was discovered.
Frightening shit. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm going to have to get used to that. Welcome to With Thunder is Applause, a podcast where two friends talk about the ideas that'll shape our uncertain future. I am your host, Steve, along with my co-host, and I'm adding a title, producer, Zach.
Well, thank you.
You really are, bro. Like, I'm just like, hey, bro, let's talk about this shit right here. And I'm like,
here's all the clips. Make it happen.
And you're like, all right, this is how we're going to do. We're going to do this one, and then we're going to do this one. That's awesome. It's awesome. So how are you doing, man?
Better than you, at least sickness-wise. Still congested, though. You know, I live in the valley. You know, we get all the smog and everything. So doing all right. They cut down the redwood tree out in front of my house and left me with a whole bunch of basically, 4 of them so far, and they got like 5 left. Oh, yeah, and I counted the rings, and it's like 33 to 37 years old. It was kind of hard to count. But yeah, and they left me with a nice big pile of redwood dust, more or less, for me to spread out. So I got something out of it, but yeah, man, all that carbon just right back in the atmosphere pretty much.
Yeah. And trees, mature trees with 30 years is adulthood, you know.
Oh, yeah.
A redwood will live 1,000 or whatever. Like 30 years is a big tree.
It was super interesting seeing the rings because it was just, you know, small, bigger. And then, of course, in the last like 20 or so years, each ring is only like a few millimeters. I guess it slows.
When they took them off supplemental irrigation, their first
probably what it is. Yeah.
And they struggle, man, because they're surrounded by fucking blacktop. So like most of the water they're getting is probably lateral water movement underground.
Yeah.
Rather than infiltration from the top because it's all pavement.
And the big problem was that they were hitting into the sewage, which is why they were removed. So
we're
finding water.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. So today's topic is kind of a continuation of a few things we've talked about. We've talked a lot about U.S. imperialism. We also talked about disasters. And we had mentioned a number of things, including volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and floods, and other things that are related to both just kind of natural hazards that we have zero control over, some of which are the consequence of climate change, a lot of which are more disastrous now because of the way we've developed our urban areas and created infrastructure that's vulnerable to those disasters, like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions or floods. Right. And today we're talking about clearly a man-made disaster, which is the potential for nuclear conflict or nuclear war, nuclear exchange.
Natural. Man, we just get these off the nuke trees.
Yeah. And that's because in the news recently, there has been kind of some lobbing of threats, so to speak. And so we're like, well, you know, for me personally, I can't speak for anybody else, but like I did a lot of research into surviving, short-term radiation and other things when I genuinely thought Hillary Clinton might fucking win. And I was terrified that it would lead to nuclear war.
Yeah.
And of course, Democrats are now in power and they're threatening nuclear war. And it's just kind of ironic at this point that like the ones that are supposed to be the rational, sane ones are in fact the fucking insane ones.
Right.
Um,
Kind of
yeah.
their thing. I
So
mean, it's
go
really
ahead.
terrible because this is just, I am a child of the early 80s, and it reminds me of, this stuff, where you learn to duck and cover.
That's awesome.
Like, it's really what we're going to be back to. Now we're going to have our kids worried about not only active shooters, but hiding from nuclear war. Great, fantastic. Can we put any more on their plate? Make them any more nervous and anxious?
Right.
We're doing
And
so bad.
we're gonna get into a lot of we only scratch the surface on all these things because honestly, there's scholars who like know this shit in and out, and we're not those.
No.
But we are going to discuss, a little bit because there's this kind of idea among the defense establishment, the think tanks in DC, right? They're like, well, we have them and they are a tool, like they are destructive. They're an implement of war.
Yeah.
So like maybe we can use them in a limited and tactical way to achieve like field objectives, like
Right.
take this spot or eliminate this defensive
Oh, there's a
position
bunker or something. Yeah.
Right. And so that prompts a lot of like revisiting this stuff that we really honestly like haven't had to think much about since the late 80s, right? Or really like what the START Treaty, or some other various kinds of stuff that the Reagan administration did to kind of de-escalate.
Yeah, I mean, I
attention.
was learning about it from as early as I think like 3rd grade. So what is that? 8 years old?
Yeah.
7 years old. So
Yeah.
87 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then it kind of fell out of favor by the time I'd gotten into middle school, so like 12 or so.
Yeah, I mean, in the Soviet Union collapsed, and
Fell
so
apart.
like,
Yeah.
there's really not a rivalry anymore. Like,
Right.
When it collapsed, U.S. companies were able to go in and fucking loot it and participate in the liberalization or privatization of ex-Soviet industries, etc. So the West was happy because they were, their billionaires were making billions, right?
Yeah, it just opened up new markets. Is all.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just like with China.
Mm-hmm. And control of resources, etc. Like a kind of liberalization, right? Like, which is a process that's been ongoing. So, there was less tension because now the West was kind of getting what it wanted. But now they kind of overstepped, as we discussed in an episode months ago about the expansion of NATO. And so you recently had, U.S. propaganda media talking about how Putin's this insane motherfucker and he's like threatening the West with nuclear war when it's actually they're projecting it's the opposite of that. So there are some long-term consequences of even a limited, it doesn't have to be an exchange of the whole arsenal. And in fact, like, as we'll get into today, you don't have to use that many for it to have devastating consequences, not just in terms of destruction at the epicenter, but also like long-term global consequences for innocence, on every continent, right?
Right. Yeah. I was watching a video and they calculated that you could bomb every major city and a bunch of like, border cities and stuff like that and still have 1,500 nukes left over.
It's just not necessary. And we'll probably get into that. We have a lot of clips today, but they're all really awesome. So let's get started with
Love this next one.
In which case, say your prayers, hug your children close, for the end is nigh. Unless somebody, somewhere, can see sense and draw us back. Poland
that is my bad.
Has taken,
there we go.
But now it's not a Russia-Ukraine war at all.
Bad producer.
If you study, as I have been studying, the deaths of Ukrainian, in inverted commas, service personnel in the recent battles in Ukraine, you'll see an inordinate number of Polish names. You'll see, when they're published online, you won't see them in the fake stream media, an inordinate number of Polish passports retrieved from the dead bodies of Polish fighters. There are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Polish and a smaller amount of Romanian forces already fighting at the front line in the war in Ukraine. But the big news this week was that the Pentagon confirmed for the first time that there are American forces now with their boots on the ground in Ukraine. The proximate reason for that is that they have to guard the American weapons that have been sent in such profusion into the battlefield, into the mall that this war has become even before General Winter arrives. But of course, that places them directly in the firing line because a very significant proportion of arriving NATO weaponry in Ukraine is immediately blown up by the Russian armed forces, who are themselves now arriving on the battlefield in increasing numbers, both in quantity and in quality. The Russians are now fighting according to their own military doctrine. No more ragbag of militiamen and gendarmes. This is now the real Russian army on the battlefield. And that Russian army will increase its targeting of NATO weaponry now that they know, thanks to the Pentagon, that that weaponry is escorted by American military personnel. So what happens when the first caliber missile blows up an entire platoon of official American forces on the ground in Ukraine? Well, I'm not Einstein, I'm not in possession of a crystal ball, but I think I can work out what happens next. And it's not a pretty sight. The seeding of new US nuclear missiles throughout all of its satrapies in Europe is a matter, or ought to be, of grave concern. In Western countries, most people don't even know that it has happened. Only those that follow military affairs with any degree of closeness are aware that the US has massively reinforced its nuclear strike force throughout the NATO countries, including my own here in Great Britain. But the farther you go, the closer you get to the Russian border, those missiles exist more thickly. And so the scene is being set.
Muted again. There we go.
I said the scene is being set for some really bad shit. What are your thoughts?
Well, he was talking about how you have to have the troops in there to guard them. I mean, of course you do, because you couldn't let them fall into enemy hands. And if you're talking about letting things fall into enemy hands, you're fighting a war. So we're now directly fighting a war. Fantastic.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because, like, what he leads with, and to be clear, George Galloway is an ex-MP in the British Parliament. His career ended shortly after the beginning of the Iraq War, because I don't exactly remember why he left, if he lost his election or if he resigned in protest or something.
Mhm.
But he was one, like, you can go back and find some speeches of him just tearing into, but especially American imperialism, and questioning like the allyship between the UK and the US. And just generally being like a really sane voice of reason on international diplomacy. And then now he had a show on Russia Today, and I think that obviously that doesn't exist in the United States anymore. And I think that's like a radio program that they film for YouTube or something. Anyway, he's solid voice of reason on that stuff. And yeah, he's right. A lot of people don't pay attention, and a lot of people here stateside are like fucking bloodthirsty. Like, yeah, we got to help the Ukrainians. And like,
every time there's someone else to kill, people are on it. As soon as we had 9/11, there were just tens of thousands of people at least talking it up that they wanted to go fight.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and I mean we've discussed this with this kind of schooling and everything else. Like we're kind of, it's part of our national mythos is
Yeah.
to be conquerors and to murder people. Like, and you can't really shake it. Like it'll take a lot of crisis to deconstruct that within our minds. We'll have to shift to new cultures that emerge in these places once the United States as a political entity ceases to exist.
Mhm.
But anyway, like it's kind of interesting because it's shifted from a proxy war to now weapons, right? And my immediate thought, and this is how fucked up like the US is, right? It's like, why didn't they just smuggle the weapons on like a civilian transport like they did in the Lusitania and all that stuff?
Like a little bit of duplicity.
Yeah, it basically, we were using like civilian transports to smuggle weapons, and then the enemy knew that, so they blew that up, and then the press was like, "Oh, they killed civilians," and then
Right.
that got the public into going to war, right? I think that's the history. It's been a while since I read it. Anyway, there's been things like that. The British were doing that too, and the German U-boats were like sinking basically passenger liners that the whole hull was like loaded with weapons.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it was. Is they were pretending as though it was not full of material for war, but it absolutely was. And so the Germans are just like, well, I guess we got to blow up civilian ships. Yeah.
And the fucked up thing is, like, even if you like follow, like, there's no real like laws of war, right? Like, it's just kind of a nice idea to have some like ground rules, I guess, but like,
Yeah.
they don't really exist in the grand scheme of things,
Well,
right?
and if you were to follow the laws that people seem to think exist, like where you don't have civilian casualties unless it's avoidable, then those civilians become shields. You can
Right.
just
Well, that's
hide
the
behind
thing, is that you're not. That's part of the international law. You're
them.
not supposed to use humans as shields, and
And
so
yet,
when you do, they become a legitimate military target.
yeah. And so,
Um, and maybe that's why the US isn't hiding. And I think a lot of it is just fucking dick swinging. Honestly, I can't really, I can't, for lack of a better term, dude. Like, it really just kind of feels like dick swinging, because, like, it's like, oh yeah, we're just going to escort these weapons into this country that you're actively fighting a war in, and Congress seems to be able to quickly find tens of billions of dollars to funnel weapons to neo-Nazis and other factions in the Ukraine, while like
people starve at
potholes
home.
get bigger and healthcare continues to decline. I can't even get, I'm paying fucking $11 a COVID test at the pharmacy because I can't, like, I'd have to drive all the way to the county public health to pick one up if I wanted, like
Yeah.
all sorts of other bullshit like that. Like, but we're spending a boatload of money on guns and rockets and shit for the Ukrainians.
Yeah. What's the figure for solving world hunger? Like 32 billion or something like that.
Chump
Could have had it
change,
done by
exactly.
now. Could have had it done by now.
Could have done it a long time ago.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother story. But anyway, what's interesting is this is kind of, and the reason we included this clip is because it sets up what's actually happening on the ground, right? Which is U.S. personnel escorting weapons into a war zone, fully aware that other NATO forces escorting weapons were targeted and destroyed, as is reasonable in that, as much as you could say war is reasonable, right? Which it's not, but legitimate military target. So they put U.S. personnel there. Is that a provocation?
It seems like they're trying to drag us into war. Yeah.
And I also think that it's just kind of like, okay, then our personnel will go. We'll just sacrifice these young men and women,
right?
Because they're a legitimate target now. But if you attack us, know that like now it's a hot war between us, not a proxy war.
Right.
By virtue of U.S. personnel, other than like advisors and of course CIA agents have been there since fucking the color revolution, right? Like, or even longer. They're everywhere. But U.S. personnel is there, but like actually uniformed military personnel getting shot at or rocket attacked or whatever would be perceived and utilized to basically get permission from the American public for a hot war, which sets us up with all this stuff about nukes, and is it possible to use a nuclear weapon in a limited tactical form?
I vote no.
Yeah,
Radiation doesn't care, what your target is. It goes where it wants to go.
that's right. And really, as we'll find later in the show, like the radiation not really one of the bigger problems.
Not right away. It becomes a bigger problem later on. But yeah.
Oh, it's a big deal, but I just mean as far as like, as far as like the biggest issue, radiation would be somewhat limited, right? Most of it rains out pretty quick, so you're talking about like hundreds of miles, of exclusion area or whatever, and potentially more, right? Like there's people who've tracked cancer cases in the U.S. showing prevailing winds, like the jet stream, and incidents of cancer along that in the 5 to 10 years after nuclear testing in New Mexico.
Right. And you can even see it just with coal plants. Like it doesn't even have to be a nuclear explosion. Just
Yeah,
the
you're right.
radioactivity from coal plants is enough to do it. So like,
precisely.
now amp that up.
It's not a big deal, but
there are other bigger deals for sure.
Yeah, radiation exposure and increased rates of cancer and stuff are going to be relatively minor compared to some much more massive consequences.
True. So take that and hold that in your head for a little while until we get to that.
Yeah. So we now know the U.S. is putting itself in a position to provoke an attack against it.
Right.
Which sets up this kind of standoff.
Probably drag us into war. And really, regardless if the American people as a whole want it or not, it's not up to us. It's up to Congress and the president to declare that war. And we can make as many phone calls as we want, trying to convince them to be rational and not do something. And they still got the vote because we put them in office. And what are we going to do after that? Take them out of office? It's too late.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I still need to fill out my ballot, but like the guy running for Congress that's not the incumbent, he's fucking worse. He's a Democrat, and
we spent like 2 or 3 hours looking at shit sandwiches and what's that?
Giant douches
and shit sandwiches. Yeah.
So what are we moving on to next? I think we're moving on to President.
Here we go. Vladimir Putin. Yeah, he's going to tell us his own words
of the Russian state, not a dictator.
I tried to find a non-Western source that translated this, and I couldn't. I tried for like a half an hour looking for a non-Western translation of this speech, and I could not find it. So we are relying on The Guardian.
Western media.
Western media to do its best.
Before you roll the clip, what was your observation when you were looking specifically for a speech where he addresses this? Other than it was mostly Western media.
I mean, trying a bunch of different keywords, it was really hard to find the specific speech itself. And then once I got down, like what kind of the accepted nickname of the speech was, at that point, it was all like the best I did was a guy who I think like used to work for Al Jazeera, but wasn't currently with Al Jazeera. And he was interviewing with another guy about it, but it was really, really long and didn't fit into our format. and so I ended up not using it. But yeah, I mean, you can kind of like tell, as you'll see from the video, and his posture. And I mean, he's always that cold kind of guy who doesn't really like get too awful loud or anything like that. He just kind of lets his creepiness speak for him.
Creepiness, that's an interesting word. My observation, and the reason I asked you, was that like at least on YouTube, I searched Putin speech nukes or whatever, and like the headlines on it are unbelievably like suggestive. Like you can't get like you can't get like an unbiased presentation, like even if it's just raw footage. This one is edited and we don't know how. Right, because I couldn't find the original recording of the speech. So this is edited. We're not really sure how. It doesn't seem to be edited in a nefarious way per se. It might just be for like clarity, or they needed to package it up in less than 2 minutes for the way they format their mass media stuff these days. Something that you can share via social media and stuff, right? Like that's how they've shifted to this kind of short format stuff. So that might have just been edited for clarity and to fit that. But I mean, look at the title there. I'm not bluffing, in quotes. Putin warns West over nuclear weapons, which makes it sound like he's threatening the U.S. But that's not actually what's happening.
Yeah.
And so let's hear him in his words as translated, presumably by Westerners in Western press. But it seems, to not be completely, fabricated to show him in any other light as an irrational head of state.
Correct.
Мы сделаем все, чтобы обеспечить безопасные условия для проведения референдумов. Для того, чтобы люди могли выразить свою волю. И то решение о своем будущем, которое примет большинство жителей Донецкой и Луганской народных республик, Запорожской и Херсонской областей, мы поддержим. В своей агрессивной антироссийской политике Запад перешел всякую грань. Мы постоянно слышим угрозы в адрес нашей страны, нашего народа. Некоторые безответственные политики на Западе не только говорят о планах по организации поставок в Украине дальнобойных наступательных вооружений, систем, которые позволят наносить удары по Крыму, другим регионам России. Такие террористические удары, в том числе с использованием западного оружия, уже наносятся по приграничным населенным пунктам Белгородской и Курской областей. В ход пошел и ядерный шантаж. Речь идет не только о поощряемых Западом обстрелах Запорожской атомной электростанции, что грозит атомной катастрофой, но и о высказываниях некоторых высокопоставленных представителей ведущих государств НАТО о возможности и допустимости применения против России оружия массового поражения, ядерного оружия. Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения, а по отдельным компонентам и более современными, чем у стран НАТО. И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф. А те, кто пытаются шантажировать нас ядерным оружием, должны знать, что роза ветров может развернуться и в их сторону.
Yeah, so it's fucking tough because it's fucking scary, but at the same time, like, that's a rational response from a head of state that says, we're not just gonna like let you bowl over us and threaten our territorial integrity and threaten the safety of our people, and in some cases like that also means access to the Black Sea, the possession of Crimea, among other things. Like, you're not going to threaten to take away our ability to trade or defend ourselves or whatever, like, but just by threatening us. Like, and unfortunately, I don't think that's true when he says, oh, we have more sophisticated weapons in NATO. I know very little about their arms industry, but I know that they're a fairly poor country. I mean, I don't actually know their GDP, but I know that they're probably not investing massive amounts of money in like super high-end technology. And that maybe is just my own bias, right? Like, I just can't picture it, so I don't think it exists. I don't know, where are you at on that? Do you think that was fucking bullshit or what?
The talking about their weapons,
saying that they have more sophisticated weapons than NATO.
They might have like certain ones, and so there's like a grain of truth to it. But overall, I don't think so. I mean, their GDP is $1.5 trillion,
which compared to the U.S. is
it was
30 trillion.
20. So I mean, it's a little, probably like, what is that? Like 40%? No, not even.
Very small,
significantly smaller. But and it's also a very large country, right? So there's a lot of like sunk costs just in maintaining connectivity.
Well, and then
the various regions. Go ahead.
something to think about is some of the places in the region, Germany 3.7 trillion, UK 2.6, France 2.6, the and
California.
Italy 2.0. I don't, it's not broken out on the list I'm looking at, but I think we're pretty huge. But my point is that these countries that are actually the ones that are close to them are not as much above them, and also are
Okay.
pretty well known to not put vast amounts of money into their military.
The French, the French and the British less so. They
Yeah,
still spend a fuck ton though. So does Germany.
yeah.
They
But I mean,
spend a lot of money on
comparatively,
their militaries.
yeah. So I mean, they could be pretty close in certain aspects, but I don't think so. But I mean, like,
Doesn't
yeah,
matter.
right. And we'll be, or I'll do the rationale. Like you were saying, it's like imagine if someone said, okay, we're going to start bombing, on Guam, the Virgin Islands, or any of our other overseas territories that we own. I guess
Colonies, yeah.
I don't know what the fuck you want to call it, but yeah, our colonies overseas. If anybody were to start threatening those, our president would come on and say things very similar to what are being said here,
Right.
even if other countries were like, you don't own Guam and the Virgin Islands. Like, he said Crimea and other Russian regions, establishing that, like, in his mind, those are his, they belong to, or to Russia. And we can debate that all we want, but there are Russians in there. And so it's just like there are Americans in Guam and the Virgin Islands and all that stuff. And so, like, pretty rational response. I imagine that Biden would make a similar speech, albeit much slower, um, if the situation was reversed. Yeah.
Yeah, and it has been a civil war, and then the front end of that, we're going to include all these clips in the description, I believe,
Yes.
so people can watch them in full,
Already
and
there.
watch the ads and support them if you
Please
have
do. Yes.
the funds to give them Patreon money or whatever. But at the beginning of that clip, George Galloway was talking about how of the George Galloway clip, he's talking about how it was a civil war.
Yeah.
And there's ethnic Russians who wanted to be aligned with Russia. And I play a game with someone who's Russian and who's like, I have a lot of Russian family who lives in Eastern Ukraine. So, like,
Right.
there is this connection between those regions. And of course, like, the western part of the countries we discussed before wants to align with Europe. And that is seen as like NATO advancing yet again right into probably the most strategic area, the most
Resources.
geostrategic important area that they have access, that Russia has access to,
Right.
is the Black Sea, because like all their other ports are up in the Baltics, and that shit's like fucking ice, and it's hella cold and all that other shit. Like,
Yeah.
down there, it's a lot better. It's a better place to have a military installation and be able to protect your borders and have access to trade and stuff. Whatever.
Yeah, because no one's going to attack the northern Russian borders.
Yep. I mean, yeah,
Fuck
exactly.
that.
The
Too
fucking
cold, too
Germans
cold.
fucked up and did that shit like twice, didn't they?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah,
Napoleon.
did it twice. Okay, so my point on that last one is just how he's just a rational actor, and like, he didn't sound fucking crazy. He's just like, hey, stop threatening us. So now we know the US is moving weapons, including strike capabilities that can hit like important military assets and or civilians, and also threatening the use of nukes. And now you have the Russian state saying, hey, better fucking knock this shit off, because like, you're putting us in a position. They're the dog that's backed into the corner. I might have made this analogy before. That's like, what the fuck else do you do except fucking bite, right?
Yeah.
You can only growl. So that was him growling, right? So maybe we should be like, oh shit, he doesn't like this. Maybe we should give him some space, right?
Like, he's got some teeth. Oh, look, he does.
Not calling the Russians dogs again. We have to clarify that. But it's what it is, right? Like,
yeah.
That's a warning to like back the fuck off.
Right.
And so there's this real tense moment happening that's kind of a lot of people are oblivious to, because we're too busy being like, oh, rah, rah, my candidate's going to get elected, and that really matters to me, even though they all serve the same fucking ruling class. And like,
we didn't have any third-party candidates this time around. I think there was like one of the races was a Republican versus a Libertarian. That was as close as it got, and that's just.
And who'd you pull for? Or did you leave it blank?
I think I just left it blank.
I find
not a
that
choice.
the older I get, the more of my ballot is left blank.
Yeah.
I just don't.
I've got to cross them out. That way someone at the office doesn't fill it in for you.
No, I think that they're taken straight from and then slid through. But you're right. I should always do other and then just like draw the best middle finger.
They didn't even have room for that on ours. There were no spots
for write-ins.
Votes. Yeah.
Really?
Whatsoever. Yeah.
Huh. That's strange. I mean, I know
just vote for the ones that are available.
I know that to have like a write-in, you can't just write someone. Like you still have to file as a write-in candidate.
Yeah, I mean you can, it won't count, but yeah.
It's so fucking hard. Like the way that our system is if you're not part of one of the two major political parties with deep ties to rich fucking people in your area, like the local ruling classes, right? The property owners, the business owners, etc. Like if you're not connected into those into one of the wings of the big fat middle finger, right? Like then you have no fucking political future.
We had a bill here asking for the citizens of this city to sponsor improvements to CSU Fresno, a state-owned school, and it was put forth by a construction company.
Of course.
Who do you think is going to get those contracts?
Right.
Hey, man.
Precisely. It's just so fucking.
This is the system we're dealing with.
So gross. But anyway, like we should definitely we should probably do like a fucking post mortem or something on like third parties and stuff because I have a lot of experience in third parties. Within like the kind of structure of parties. I've never really like run as like a major candidate, like state candidate or anything, but like, I do have some experience of behind the scenes. And it does not surprise me that they don't have any candidates because we're all just kind of in the tail between our legs. We fucking lost. Like the counter revolution won. And I told some other organizer friends I have that same thing, right? Like, hey, the fucking counter revolution won. Like the best thing that we can do is kind of keep the revolutionary fire alive until another moment comes along. Because like fighting within this context, like under these circumstances with these ground rules that we didn't write, like not gonna fucking happen. But let's keep that revolutionary fire alive because eventually unrest will get bad and we need to have good ideas to compete in the space.
Yeah.
Or it's just gonna be fucking fascism.
Yeah.
Right.
Speaking of fires.
Yeah.
I'll move on to our clip about nuclear fires.
Let's do
this is a short clip from a larger video. The first two phases of the video talk about the initial blast of a nuclear bomb being detonated over a large city, and then the actual thermonuclear fires that engulf out further in the shockwave. This third part is the really terrible part of it all. I mean, it's all terrible, but this is the worst part.
Just establish, like, summarize it. There's a blast that vaporizes fucking everything within like a certain radius.
Some radius, yeah.
And then there's another area out from that that's all more or less flattened.
Yeah, shockwave, further heat. Yeah. A thing set on fire, gas stations ignite because, of course, they do. Yeah,
that's where the duck and cover shit comes from.
Yeah.
Right. It's like if you're
in that initial area, you're fucking
not
dead.
In ground zero. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. In that initial blast radius, you're just dead, or you'll wish you were. And I mean, maybe if you're like in a subway, you might survive, but you'll wish you hadn't. And then and the shockwave fireball area, like you're gonna probably get burnt alive if you're outside, and there's a fairly good chance that you're just going to you'll be inside of a building and not be able to get out because it'll have collapsed. And then we get the third phase, which is the phase that is terrible but not quite as bad as some of the stuff we're going to cover after this. So let's go.
Awesome, thanks.
The third phase begins in the coming hours and days. We're used to the idea that help will come no matter the disaster. This time is different. A nuclear explosion is like every natural disaster at once. There are hundreds of thousands or millions of people with serious injuries, lacerations, broken bones, serious burns. In the next few minutes and hours, thousands more will die because of these injuries. Countless people are trapped in collapsed buildings like in earthquakes, or blinded by the flash, deaf from the blast wave, and unable to flee through streets impassable with rubble and debris. They're terrified, confused, and don't know what's happened to them or why. Most likely, many hospitals have been leveled along with all the other buildings, and most medical professionals are either dead or injured along with everyone else. The survivors lucky enough to have been in metro tunnels or standing in the right place to be unburned and unhurt won't have truly escaped harm yet. Depending on the type of weapon, where it explodes, and even the weather, an awful black rain can begin, with radioactive ash and dust descending on the city, covering everything and everyone. The invisible, malicious, silent horror of radiation takes its turn. Every breath carries poison to the lungs of the survivors. Over the coming days, the people who receive the highest doses of radiation exposure will die. There will be no help, not for hours or maybe even days. Civilization doesn't operate when there is a total breakdown of infrastructure. Roads are blocked, train tracks warped, runways cluttered with rubble. No water, no electricity, no communication, no stores to replenish supplies from. Help from surrounding cities will have a hard time entering the disaster zone, and even if they can, the radioactive contamination will make it risky to get too close. After a nuclear attack, you're on your own. So, bit by bit, people emerge from the rubble, on foot, contaminated with radioactive fallout, carrying what little they may have left. They are slow, in pain, traumatized, and they all need food, water, and medical treatment fast. And the damage done by a nuclear weapon doesn't end when the fires burn out and the smoke clears. The hospitals in the neighboring cities are under-equipped for a disaster of this scale and overwhelmed with tens or hundreds of thousands of patients with serious injuries. In the weeks, months, and years to come, many of those who survived will succumb to cancers like leukemia. The reason no government wants you to think about all this is because there is no serious humanitarian response possible to a nuclear explosion. There's no way to really help the immediate victims of a nuclear attack. This is not a hurricane, wildfire, or earthquake, or nuclear accident. It is all of these things at once, but worse. No nation on Earth is prepared to deal with it.
We can't even deal with one at a time.
Yeah, we can't even deal with one at all.
Yeah. Every time a hurricane comes through, we flub that. Every time an earthquake comes through, we flub that. We just are totally unprepared and totally unwilling to actually be prepared for natural disasters. Like, it's not a matter of resources or anything like that. Like, we could do it. It's just political will.
Yeah, and so that's like a really big deal. And like, so I think that's kind of feeds into this idea of like, can there be a tactical like nuclear strike, even like a small like payload kind of situation?
Right.
The reality is yeah, that's really fucking bad, right?
Yeah, and that's talking about a very large nuke over a very large city. It's not talking about like, oh, look, there's one building, kaboom, there's a little bit of fallout. Like,
right, and that's the kind of interesting thing that Putin said also in his response or whatever. Is this he's like, why are you like doing that? You realize like the wind blows like all directions. Like,
yeah,
you're not fucking safe. You're like, and he's what he's trying to do, is cast doubt on his neighbors and make his neighbors tell the U.S. to back the fuck off.
Yeah, like shit
Right?
blows
Like, you don't
west,
want to
right?
radiation cloud.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, like, so you do a tactical nuke on near the Russian border, and if the wind is blowing east, you just fucked over Ukraine too. Like come on.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous to think that nukes can be used in any capacity and not have collateral damage.
Yeah. When we're done here, Tori, when we're kind of doing a wrap up, I'll talk about a Netflix documentary I watched.
All right.
It's connected. But anyway, now we're going to move back to Dr. Helfand.
Yes.
He is with he was the lead clip of the show. So the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, I think is the organization.
Those letters match up.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I actually looked it up when we were doing our final prep.
Gotcha.
Just they were like, what the fuck was that acronym? International Physicians for the prevention of nuclear war.
Yes.
So physician, whatever qualifies you to be a member in that organization, probably a doctor, a surgeon, some kind of medical researcher, I'm sure. So anyway, they've done a lot of research on what that clip was just talking about in terms of like how difficult it'd be to respond and fallout and you know, kind of like various kinds of health consequences at various distances under various conditions, right? And then something that was lacking a lot of research is how this would affect beyond the kind of radiation threat
Right.
and the sheer destructive power of a nuclear weapon, but like what else happens that could affect global health. And
Something that I didn't think about till now is, and didn't get addressed there, is what about the various types of contamination that are released from the destruction of infrastructure? Sewage plants that are
Oh, yeah.
destroyed, just dead bodies that are left to rot in the rain and stuff like that. You know, gas leaks, all of that. Chemical plants. You know, we have chemical plants everywhere, and that's all going to get, you know, released into the environment in the area too. And so it becomes even more so than, you know, earthquake and all that. It's like you said, it really is a combination of everything. And how do you respond to that? Like, you know, what is the low hanging fruit that gets taken care of first?
they probably figure out which way radiation is being spread the furthest outside of like the immediate destructive areas, and then they move people.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's what you can do. Is like, here's people that aren't yet exposed, but all indications say they will be exposed. Let's move those people. Everybody on the inside is fucked.
That's true. You know, like anything can become a Superfund site. So
yeah, and you're absolutely right, because I think of even just like hurricane in like North Carolina, where like the river overflooded its banks and like washed out a hog farm.
Yeah, the pig
and,
shit.
Like,
yeah.
And it's just like toxic fucking pig poop, like poisoning water and shit. And that was like relatively minor. And like pig poop is not toxic.
If it gets into
when
the
it's
water
not in
table, it
concentrated
is.
quantities. What's that?
I see. When it's not concentrated, but yeah, when it's concentrated like that, it gets into the waterways. Yeah, it's
it's
toxic.
bad. But like otherwise, we took a benign thing and made it bad. And
like concentrating.
But you're absolutely right, because like in New Orleans, they'd spray paint X's on the house, and then each quadrant of the X had a number or a letter that was like, so that when people are going through an area, they're like, okay, the house has been searched, this blah blah blah. Well, what you saw on almost all of them was TFW, which meant toxic floodwater, because like all the household chemicals, like the shit, like your oven cleaner and stuff like that,
right,
that's under your fucking sink, like all of that would get released into
bleach, ammonia, all the things that we take for granted as cleaning agents are highly toxic.
Yeah, and there's, you know, ambulance chaser law firms, right? Like doing class action lawsuits against like PG&E for like toxicity. So they're like, if you had like breathing problems after the campfire and you lived in these areas, contact us and we'll get you compensation. Because the reality is that everybody that lived in my community inhaled like all sorts of toxic building materials. Like all of those things get vaporized, and that's in the air. So it's not just the radiation, but like you said, it's we created an incredibly toxic environment, and here would just be a perfect storm of releasing all those toxins at once.
Yeah, man, vaporized fiberglass and shit like that, gypsum.
Oh yeah, vinyl, PVC, like fucking windows or doors and trim, and you know, all those paints. Like most paints are pretty like benign at this point, but like some of those houses were old, so they might use paints.
I'm just thinking about all the like drywall, like just drywall. It seems so benign, but if you vaporize that and then it re-solidifies into like fine, you know, granules and comes back down, and you're breathing that shit, like amongst everything else, now you've got crystals in your lungs that don't dissolve in water.
Yeah, and you have all the automobiles that are like the rubbers and the plastics, and you know the those paints, especially maybe house paints are less toxic, but those paints certainly are. And then all the fluids, brake fluid, all that shit just gets fucking burned up, dude.
Yeah,
It's all airborne. It all settles down, toxifies soil. And this
See,
would
Chris
just
Kozak
be
was
like,
trying to, keep it like light, and then we're bringing it down.
but I mean, that last line in there where he's like, it's kind of like a hurricane, an earthquake, a wildfire, and
Yeah.
what was the last one?
A tsunami, I think.
A tsunami. Yeah.
It
All
was like,
rolled into one.
and
It's
no
just-
nation on earth is prepared for to deal with that. Like,
and they're not. Let's play Dr. Helfand.
here we go.
This is an event unprecedented in human history. The death of 2 billion people would not be the extinction of our species were it to happen, but it would be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there's no reason to think that the very intricate, interrelated, complex economic system that we all depend on would survive that kind of disruption. Yeah, I mean, to this point, no one has really challenged these findings. We say ourselves that they're preliminary. The climate science, I think, is very sound. The effect that this kind of a war would have on temperature, on precipitation, and so on, has now been examined by several different climate models. They all show basically the same results. The impact on food production, the data is thinner, and we have said this from the outset. We have been trying to get governments around the world to take this threat seriously and to do more robust studies to confirm or possibly refute the data that we've generated about food production.
And of course, here he is talking about a more widespread nuclear war where there is the threat of nuclear winter and the effect of food production there. So, I mean,
Well, so I think there's an earlier part in this that we might have missed or something, but he's basically their scenario that they used as a baseline was India and Pakistan each launched 50 weapons, Hiroshima-sized weapons,
Little
which
babies.
is like it's less than 0.5% of the global arsenal.
Yeah.
50 weapons is less than 0.5%. And if those two countries each launched 50, what happens is those fires, like the last clip discussed, it just vaporizes shit, then lights everything else on fire because like it breaks gas lines and all that shit, right?
Blasts it up into the air.
Yeah, and it creates a smoke column that extends beyond the lower atmosphere where we have clouds and rain and weather, and basically goes up into an area where we just have to wait for it to fall. And I don't know if he gets it here, but it's basically like they estimated that it could last for like 7 to 10 years for this to degrade and eventually come out of the upper atmosphere. Go ahead.
Well, and the reason for that is that it's so fine and it gets above so many of the wind currents and things like that, that as it tries to fall, it just gets pushed back up.
Yeah, so it basically gets into like lower or outer atmosphere, basically outer space.
Near like, like near
there's enough
low
gravity
orbit
to fucking hold it there.
Yeah.
And then it just blocks out the sun. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of the idea of a nuclear winter. And they said if it was like a larger like exchange between like US and Russia with like their larger, more powerful weapons that would
Those two countries control the lion's share of the nuclear weapons.
thousands each. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they there you can find all sorts of information. Like most countries have like a couple hundred. I think North Korea's got like fucking 4. Israel's got like 250 or something.
Some of the bigger, like some of the bigger European nations might have like 1,000 to 2,000.
Yeah,
and I think America and Russia each have like 15,000.
Yeah, something like
that. Fuck it, why not?
Fuck it, why not? It's fucking crazy. But anyway, so their scenario that they were looking at was a limited regional conflict where each launches 50 small, like pretty much the smallest weapon. I mean, they probably make them smaller at this point, but Hiroshima size. So like really like early nuclear weapon technology that was destructive, don't get me wrong, but not like, Bombazara or whatever the fuck, the all the gigantic hydrogen bombs and all that other shit, right?
Right. As far as I know, these are just fission bombs.
Yeah, plutonium or whatever.
Yeah.
And so in that scenario, they estimated that something like 2 billion people would die from starvation, basically, because you'd have widespread crop failure all across the northern hemisphere, because mostly that's going to come up and be in like the northern hemisphere. If there was an nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, or Russia and US, because they're all in the northern hemisphere, so it would stay largely contained in the south. They'd be a little bit better off, right?
But there's also not a whole lot of arable land in the global south.
Yeah, exactly. Is places like Australia and stuff, like there'd
Most
be
of Africa.
survivors, but that's what he said. He's like,
Yeah.
it's not going to be the extinction of the human race if there's like a regional, but it'll cause probably 30% of the global population to die over the course of like 2 years.
Oh yeah, and I mean, he was talking about the intricately linked supply lines that we have, and we couldn't even fucking figure shit out for COVID for the first few months.
Nope.
And
We
that
still
was
haven't fucking figured it out,
minimal.
bro.
That's true.
I just
I'm
got
trying to
noticed
give us
more
some
people.
credit, but yeah. I mean, and it's been minimal, compared to those numbers.
Yeah.
I don't even think it's in the hundreds of millions yet.
Is that for COVID?
Yeah,
Deaths?
yeah.
No, fuck no. 100 million people? I don't think so, dude. I'd be surprised if it was more than like 10.
It's only 6.6 million. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's
Now
a lot less
multiply
than
that by like a factor of 100. Fuck.
No, I thought maybe 10 globally, but
Yeah.
again, they undercount. Like those numbers aren't super accurate.
So let's just round
But
up.
they
to
didn't
10.
undercount
Yeah.
by like 95 million.
Yeah. It's still a factor of 200 off of what these guys are talking about. Yeah.
Right.
And so for sure, everything shuts down because so many fucking people. Oh wow, man.
Yeah.
But hey, let's play at warfare, and like you were saying, wave our dicks around.
Yes,
Wrinkly and old though they may be. Of course, it's the wrinkly old ones that get waved in our faces. Fuckers.
Damn it! Why can't it be like one of them nice fucking
Nice
20
fresh
something
pink
dicks?
pussy. Oh man, yeah.
I'm just kidding. Let's finish this clip. Or is that it?
No, there is one final portion.
Let us watch.
Indeed.
A few years' time. But at this point, this is the only data that's out there. And it's been in the public domain now for 6 years, and no one has seriously challenged it. And so I think at this time, we need to proceed on the basis of this data. It's the best data available. And, when you discover that a medication that's been released on the market appears to be having terrible consequences, even if the data is preliminary, you pull the medicine until you are able to study it more closely. And we need to get rid of the weapons until we know that this is going to happen. And of course, again, this is the most limited of nuclear wars. A large-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia, which is a very real possibility, would, we know, have consequences far more catastrophic. And on this, there's essentially no disagreement in the scientific community. A war between the United States and Russia involving just the weapons, which are on alert now, that are deployed now, that are available for use in the short order in the course of a war. That war would put enough soot into the upper atmosphere to create a new ice age. It would happen within a matter of days. It would last for a decade or more. And that would stop most food production on the planet. And under those conditions, I think there's no one who argues other than that the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. And under those conditions, we might become extinct as a species.
Yeah. So another thing that there's really great material. I forget his name. Maybe we can include it in the description later. There's a doctor that was doing this, or scientist doing this research back in like the 80s, and they like him and Carl Sagan like presented to Congress on this issue.
Right.
And a whole bunch of stuff like that. And anyway, they were showing, and it was remarkable because we talk about how serious fucking climate change is. We've talked about it here, of like when you look at like the geologic climate record, and you see that, you're like, oh wow, that's significant changes to the condition of the planet, like the ecosystems, when a 2 or 3 degrees C warming took place over 200, 300, 400,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years, and it's a big fucking deal. Now we've compressed that into 250 or 300 years for as far as climate change.
A factor of 1,000 less.
Yeah, and what they're talking about is a 2 degree drop, a 2 degree C drop roughly over baseline or under baseline, within like a month or two.
Mhm.
And so we're like, oh my God, 2 degrees C warming is fucking insane. We have to stop it. Of course, we're not doing anything. We're not stopping it. It'll be 3.5 or 4 by end of century for sure.
Yeah.
And it's catastrophic. But this would be like this nuclear winter. That's why he said it'd bring in an ice age. Like it's literally like so little light would get to the planetary surface. You're talking about massive like ecosystem destruction. Like 2 degrees warming is a big deal over 300 years. It's a big deal over 100,000 years. 2 degrees cooling in like a month or two would be like, yeah, it's hard to fathom like what that would be.
Most species are not equipped to handle large changes in temperature like that, even small changes in temperature like that. And having the sun blocked out, regardless of the temperature, all the photosynthesizing, animals and plants are gone, zooplankton and all that crap dead. Like,
Yeah, and
massive die-offs.
Yeah, and that doesn't come back. Like basically, we would have a few months of survival, eating all the livestock that needs to go because there's no fucking grass, right? And then we'd have another few months going where we're eating each other, and then we starve.
Yeah,
because there's really nothing left. Because plants can't photosynthesize, and like I think we said it in a previous show, like we either eat plants or eat other things that eat plants.
Right.
So if there's no sun, there's no photosynthesis, there's no energy being captured chemically that we can extract and take advantage of. So unless we learn how to like, well, there's I forget their phytochemical bacteria or whatever that are on like volcanic vents in the bottom of the ocean or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Unless we can learn how to fucking synthesize the energy we need from just like chemicals and water,
you can't.
We need carbon long carbon chains like sugars and carbohydrates.
And plants are really good at making those, but they need the sun.
They really are. So this is kind of like a limited conflict with just 100 nukes total of small nukes would be a big fucking deal. And if you have more than that, then it's also an even bigger deal.
And here we are with two major powers with over 10,000 total provoking each other like it's a game.
Well, are they provoking each other as much as just the U.S. is just a fucking asshole?
I mean, dicks fuck pussies.
They do. They also fuck assholes.
That's how you get shit.
Exactly. So I don't know, man. It's just kind of heady, like in the way that it's talked about. Like I tried to watch. I was like, I should check this out. It came up in my search for trying to find that speech that Putin gave. And it was like CNN, and they had like some CIA analysts like on to like help educate the public on like what's happening and all this. And it's like just the way they fucking phrase things, right? Like they could say that a completely different way that's not like planting suggestive seeds, right? But they say things, they're told to say things a particular way because they're just the fucking PR arm of the arms industry. That's all our media is. Like that's all our fucking country is. It's just fucking gigantic weapons manufacturing.
Sell $1 million, $10 million weapons that need to be used in the tens of thousands, and do it now.
Yeah, maybe we should get the corporations to like lead the charge to dismantle nuclear weapons in favor of massive amounts of conventional weapons.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah,
they're
losing out.
Like we all lose if there's a nuclear war. What you really want is conventional bombs, and a lot of them.
Yeah, more of them.
It's
Hellfire missiles. Hellfire missiles.
The world.
That way you can just cut through people with blades and shit. Oh yeah.
So that's how do we convince corporations to
I think you just
tell their puppet politicians to get rid of nukes so that they can make more money building and deploying conventional bombs?
No, the genie really is out of the bottle with nukes. I mean, now that they exist and we're convinced that we can use them as deterrents, we're going to try that until we fail. And then,
did we have a clip on deterrence?
We did. It was the very first clip we did.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's that's the thing. The human species was a nice idea while it lasted, I guess.
Yeah.
It did all right. Million years overall, I think, from the time modern Homo sapiens. It's pretty good.
I don't know. I should know that. I should know it. I thought anatomical humans were like not that long. Homo sapiens, I thought, was less than 1 million.
Oh, you're right. 200,000 years. Damn.
Yeah, 200 is what I was thinking.
Never mind. We suck. I'll probably try to up those numbers. Those are rookie numbers. Got to make it to 1 million.
But humans, like, our predecessors, right? Like the genus Homo, I think, is several million, like potentially like 15 or 20, I think.
Yeah.
And then modern anatomical humans were just the last 200. Other species of human that we could interbreed with, like Erectus and all those other ones, they existed some at the same time as us, but had older lineages, and that's over the last couple million years.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Damn it! I was
modern anatomical humans really fucked it
That's an
up
all right
quick,
experiment then. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if what takes so. I mean, obviously, if there's a fucking global nuclear war, even a regional nuclear war that causes massive starvation, the collapse of civilization.
Yeah. Even the raccoons are dead.
Yeah,
Dolphins are
exactly.
dead.
I was going to say because there might be crow people or something.
Oh,
like
that'd be nice.
Crows.
Yeah. There's a crow and 2 Ricks.
Crow and 2 Ricks. Okay. Yeah. And so here's the thing too about this whole like discussion is it's a very real possibility, and I hope that we were convincing enough
please
to show that it's not something that you should just fucking forget about. Like this escalation is ongoing. Like your government, if you're in the US or in Russia or Germany or UK or in
France.
Ukraine or whatever, they're all fucking responsible for this escalation, right?
Right.
And as serious as that is, like in a lot of ways, I know a thinker I respect a lot kind of like took these like mass casualty fantasies, and he said that they're convenient. Like you're like, oh, because like you can't conceive of industrial civilization dying of its own like internal contradictions, and so you're kind of like you cling to these like it's over in a minute because it's a lot easier to think of it disappearing relatively quick, or like a zombie apocalypse. Like Rick gets shot, Rick Grimes wakes up in the fucking hospital somehow without an infection. Months later, or weeks and weeks later, and there's been a zombie apocalypse, and he's all up. Right? Like, he's not alone. Water. He gets picked up pretty quick by someone in the neighborhood, but
no, I mean that's a good point. It is easier to imagine an almost instantaneous destruction than it is to imagine that everything that we know and hold dear just slowly fails, and we all kind of recede back into the darkness surrounding the former cities, and we go raid them occasionally.
Yeah, back to the boom boom times.
Yes,
that was a third fucking Rick and Morty reference this episode. That's awesome.
It's a good show.
It's a good show. All right, man. Do you have anything else? Oh, I wanted to mention this documentary. Check it out.
Yes.
It is called Meltdown, 3 Mile Island. It is on Netflix. If you pay for Netflix, maybe you can find it not on Netflix. If you know what I mean.
Not that we're endorsing this, but if you have a friend who's computer savvy, he could probably find a way to get it for you.
Yes, or you can.
Stealing is wrong.
Like $5 or whatever.
Stealing is wrong. It's so wrong. Don't steal.
So anyway, this show, because like I remember an argument I had after Fukushima, right? The tsunami and the nuclear disaster of Fukushima. An argument with someone who was like a whatever you call them, a Japanophile or whatever. There's
a weebo.
What's that?
A weebo.
A weebo. Okay.
Someone from Western culture who really, really loves Japan to the point where you're like, okay, dude, we get it. You love Japan.
Yeah, it drives like and loves the anime and the Hello Kitty and all that shit.
All the hentai stuff on the side of their car.
At any rate, I remember this argument pretty distinctly because like I was kind of like I was just finishing grad school where like I studied international relations and could see quite clearly how like propaganda works. And I was like, man, Fukushima is awful. Like, this is just like and people are ignoring it, like they're not even aware of how awful this is.
Mhm.
And then he's like, "Oh no, it's under control. Like it's nothing like, it's nothing like Chernobyl. Like that was the worst thing ever, blah blah blah." Yes, it was the worst disaster ever. But his reasons were because because the Soviet Union is bad and this, that, and the other thing, and blah 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 blah. When you find out for 3 Mile Island, because I brought that up, and he's like, "Oh, that wasn't a big deal at all." I didn't know a lot about it except that it was a nuclear disaster and it was instrumental in like public distrust in nuclear. But it was a partial core meltdown and it released a ton of shit. And when the guy was like, "Oh, well, in Chernobyl, it was all the fucking bureaucrats trying to hide stuff and not telling the truth and this, that, and the other thing." And then you're watching this documentary about 3 Mile Island and find out like they literally like were threatening to kill people who were trying to whistleblow on like unsafe practices because in the US, it wasn't a government bureaucrat, right, that was responsible for this fuck up and fixing it, right? No, it was a private fucking corporation and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was in their pocket, staffed by industry people, private industry people, just like every other government bureaucracy. What's that?
Cronies.
Yeah. And
always cronies.
One of the guys in there that was a whistleblower, he got into nuclear energy in nuke school and in the Navy. And he said when he walked into the building, there's like something written on the wall in the lobby or whatever that's like, "Welcome, you're about to embark on getting like a free like $50,000 education" or something. Does that say that on the wall there?
I don't remember that. We talked about it a lot, how much it costs, but I mean, we're doing a job, so it's just on the job training, really.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically the equivalent of like a 4-year education crammed into 2 years.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, there's like 2-year programs at like Embry-Riddle and shit for air traffic.
However, you didn't have to do general ed or any of that. What do they call that width and birth stuff at Chico that you had to do?
Oh, depth and breadth.
Depth and breadth. There you go.
Some things you have to do, like something like, kind of just a general idea about a broad topic.
Yeah,
and then you focus in on like, so you might do like comparative religions as like a broad thing, and then you might be like, "Oh, I'm looking at Judaism or whatever."
Right.
Yeah.
I liked him. Other people didn't like him, but anyway.
Anyway, so yeah, it was an interesting documentary that people can, and that's beyond the scope of this. We're talking specifically about warmongering and about how fucking bad this could be, and don't let the think tank people and the talking heads at mainstream media try and present this as something that is not great, but a potential tool for us in fighting the Russians and liberating Ukraine so that they can have a fucking fascist regime. And it's not, because you need to keep in mind that like even a small exchange of these weapons has not just regional consequences in terms of fallout, et cetera, so forth, and real consequences for people on the ground, like horrific deaths, but also potentially crop failure. Even like one nuke, I can imagine, might put enough soot up to cause like major changes in temperature regimes across a region, right? Like, and so maybe there's not global crop failure, like in the worst case scenario, but you're still looking at crop failure in a region. And then what happens with crop failure in a region, as we've seen, like,
well, it destabilizes the region, and if that region has nukes,
well, it destabilizes it and causes unrest and causes migration.
Yeah.
And then what does migration do? Migration, like we've seen in Europe, especially, pressure from US blowing up the Middle East and migrants heading into Europe, like, has destabilized the fucking whole continent.
Yeah.
Like it's threatening their 20th century peace that they've established largely between World War II and today, right? Like, and it's destabilizing it. And you see fucking rise of fascism, not just in Ukraine, but in Italy and in fucking Greece, and Germany even, and in Poland, right? Like,
well, and Greece was so terrible because they ended up getting stuck with so many people because they're like one of the first countries that you run into when you flee by the ocean, and then the European Union just said, "I'm sure you can handle it, but you're going to have to undergo what's it called?
Economic
the
shock
measures.
therapy?
No. The official term for the measures where they austerity. Yeah. It's like, well, since you can't afford this, you're going to have to undergo austerity. It's like, but we got a whole bunch of migrants. You going to help us with this? No. In fact, you have to cut back on all your public services.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
they totally fucked it. It's crazy.
As for the nuclear war and the 2 billion people, I would like to think that maybe we can learn nukes bad, don't use without killing 2 billion people. But more and more, it seems like we might have to just, lose a quarter or more of the population in order to actually get people to learn that, like, no, this shit's really horrific. And maybe we shouldn't do it ever again. And, before things are too late. I just don't trust that humans can do that, though. We're not very good at forward thinking.
Yes, you're right. We're not. But that's, we're programmed, right? Like,
We're just a bunch of grasshoppers.
Yeah, as far as our forward thinking is, like, it's still that way today. Do you know what the conversation we have at the breakfast table every fucking weekend?
Does it involve growing crops?
No. When we're sitting around eating breakfast.
No, I don't.
It comes up inevitably at every breakfast table. We start talking about, what do you want to eat for dinner?
It's true.
And, and that's just the reality, is that we're just like, we're programmed to be like, all right, cool, this is a great breakfast burrito. What are we going to do for dinner?
Yeah, it's true. I don't know what I'm doing for dinner.
Probably chicken. I have a kitchen witch.
Well, I do too, but you got to help her.
I did the dishes, remember? That's why.
Oh, that's right. That's why she doesn't curse you.
That's true. She just blesses me with delicious food.
Yes.
Ramen. Beef. Okay, man. Well, that was a great show, and it's interesting. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about the food question. Because not just like nuclear winter, but there's something that, I always just want to talk about all the time, which is like how dependent our food system is on fossil fuels and complex like supply and logistics chains.
Right.
Not just for the distribution, as we kind of learned, like we're seeing with inflation in food, right? Not just those things, although those things are part of the conversation, but more specifically, what an oil shock will do. And I had a friend share some stuff with me earlier, and apparently, because I'm so disconnected at this point, apparently, like, there's like diesel shortages, and they're looking at like the price of shipping to like increase significantly, further pushing inflation.
There's also this additive that you have to put in diesel fuel, and we're running into shortages of that as well. Yeah.
Do a little research on that, and then talk about the consequences of that on our food system. Because guess what? All of those machines, the only machine that doesn't need diesel fuel involved in the production of agricultural products are Mexicans. Right? Migrant laborers. They're not all from Mexico. At least in California, exploits a lot of migrant labor. And that's not a
in some of our biggest farms in the biggest part of the breadbasket. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so those workers still use fossil fuels in their day-to-day life, but
because they have to, because there's no water, and they have to drive to town to get bottled water so they don't die.
That's right. I think we covered that already here, or maybe we had a different conversation. I don't recall.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different documentaries about water.
Well, it's fire and water, right? Ice and fire, Song of Ice and Fire.
Ice and fire, yeah.
Fire and then ice, and then nuclear winter.
Yeah, for us,
fireball.
Yep, after the fireball comes the ice.
Yep. Big dragons eat little dragons, by the way. Spoiler warning.
No.
All right, man, this has been fun. And remember, when Liberty dies, he dies.
With thunderous applause.
Have a good one, y'all. Peace.
Bye.
Bye.